Welcome to FinTech Fun Talks. Today we have an exciting guest I'm looking forward to speaking with today. And for those of you just joining the podcast, we are Copper Canvas Ads Agency, and we specialize in helping FinTechs grow within a 12-month period. And today our guest is Colin Hutzan. He is the VP of Customer Experience at Thentia. Colin, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here, and would love to hear a little bit about your experience and what brought you into FinTech.
So I have spent the last 10 years in tech, but prior to that, I was in retail management. And prior to that, I got a degree in jewelry and metalsmithing. I've
Oh,
made quite the, I guess, change in path.
yeah.
I found myself working for a startup in the accounting space called Freshbooks, accounting software space, about 10 years ago as a customer service representative after I moved away from retail management. And so as Freshbooks was growing, so did I. And I left Freshbooks after 8 years as the director of global customer support operations before joining Thentia as the director of customer operations and then the VP of customer experience. So I never really planned to get into tech. What I knew is that I really liked working in service. I really liked serving customers, seeing essentially happy people. I mean, back from my retail days. And that translated really well into a customer support position at FreshBooks, which then kind of grew from there. I always liked leadership as well.
And I can see where that would translate. Making people happy is a universal language, especially across business, no matter what specific industry you're in. So you helped scale FreshBooks by, I believe it was 7 times what they were at from the time that you started to the time that you left. What were the key levers that drove that growth, and what lessons did you learn that apply to just overall and broadly to fintech scaling?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I joined FreshBooks, the company as a whole was at about 130 people, my department at about 30. And when I left, the company was about 800 people, my department at about 130, and we had quadrupled the revenue in that time frame. They had started raising investor capital by the time that I joined. Prior to that, it was a bootstrapped company for, several years. Obviously, one of the key drivers of the growth was that investor injection of capital. And then we started to add to the product and grow the team. So I was responsible for, as I moved into leadership at FreshBooks, I was responsible largely for operations and working with sales and other departments in the company to grow. That's pretty much how it began. Conceptually, I very much go by a people first mentality. Oftentimes, if you're looking at developing a process and then putting people in place to follow the processes to a T, you might end up being disappointed because things won't always go the way that you planned. And with a process in place, you're planning for things to go a certain way so that the process can then be followed again by the people you put in place. I very much believe in hiring the right individuals to help react to changes as you're scaling the company so
Yeah.
that whatever process might be in place is easily appended and changed. Or perhaps you're kind of waiting to a certain point to really nail down specific processes for different areas. So when a company's at a certain startup stage, if you try to write down processes and get people to follow them for every single operation in the business that you're responsible for, you're just going to be changing those every month or so because directions change all the time and unexpected things happen. So I think a big key learning and something that we always operated by in terms of values at FreshBooks anyway was people first. So who are the individuals that are going to help with that growth? Where are all the areas that you need, to have people in place, and what are the skill sets that you need to put in those areas? And then really letting them operate with autonomy in growing those areas. And you're there as their leader, as their advisor, and giving them information that helps them make decisions for their areas. And then you'll hit a certain stage of growth where it starts to become apparent that you can start to put processes in place. Things seem to be kind of perhaps plateauing in terms of changes happening. And that's where you can work to nail down processes that by then those teams perhaps have grown to a certain, size that you actually need some kind of guidance for them to follow. And that's when you can become more process based. But even then, as a leader, I strongly believe in very much in people first.
I can see how that empowers the people, thinking of it from an employee perspective, and how I have had those jobs where they have trusted me. They know that I am thoughtful, that I'm going to look at all the components and make a decision based on it all that I believe is best for the company and for the client. And then I've had those where you are not allowed to do anything without running it up the flagpole first. And so it really disempowers you. It makes you feel like you are not really impacting change or impacting the business at all. It's just almost the point where AI could really replace you. You can automate those types of things and get rid of them, but when you lose the human element and you use the people side of things,
Yeah, and I don't want to make it seem like I wouldn't be utilizing AI as well. Obviously,
yeah,
it's
it has its place.
everywhere, but
Yeah,
I'm not necessarily one of those individuals that thinks AI is going to replace all of our jobs because
me too.
I treat AI more like a thought partner than, something that can actually replace people. Now, it might change what people's responsibilities at work are. When AI first became a big thing in customer service, which, before ChatGPT rolled out and AI was being consumed in the way that it is now, which is pretty much for anything that we're doing, it was being utilized as a way to deflect cases in customer service, where perhaps it was redirecting a customer to a knowledge base article or something like that instead of having them, directly go and contact an individual in the support organization. And so when we were working on setting up AI to help with case deflection at FreshBooks, we weren't looking at it in a way where people would be replaced. We were looking at it more in a way where people that we have will be utilizing certain skill set to help train the AI and make it better so that we don't necessarily have to scale in a way where we're simply staffing and keeping things the way they are. Rather, we can gain a lot of customers, grow as a business, and have the AI mature where it's able to service more complex cases based on the training behind it, which again is powered ultimately by people helping the AI be trained.
And it is a process with AI. And I like how you've shown not only where you are, but what the ideal is in using the knowledge that your people have to enhance it as well. So I know a big focus for you is the customer experience and ensuring that they do have a good experience with your company. And so I'd like to pick your brain a little bit on what that looks like and how that mindset has directly impacted company growth, retention, and revenue.
So historically, you would think that, the customer focused group in an organization would be perhaps customer service. Let's say the customer service or support organization. Customer experience, which over the past, I suppose, decade or so has become more and more of a generally accepted and utilized role in a business, is not only about customer service and support, it's about the entire company. It's the entire company operating in a way that is truly putting the customer first. And I got really passionate about that as I was growing my career at FreshBooks because I was working in customer support, but there would be things that were happening downstream that would impact a customer's sentiment or by the time they got in touch with support. And I wanted to go and look at that root cause and try to solve for the root cause, because a lot of times by the time the customer is getting in touch with support and they're angry, that's a very lagging indicator around general customer satisfaction, general customer sentiment about your brand. And so I got really passionate about looking at all the different areas where customers might an impression of your brand, whether it be negative or positive, and carry that with them. And I'd want to solve for those. And so customer experience really is, as an executive in customer experience, it's a mandate to make sure that every business unit in the organization, even if they're not directly facing customers, are operating with a customer first mindset. And so I've been really excited to be able to do that in the role that I'm in now, where, I can have an influence on the entire organization, not just the support department, to address those like root causes for customer sentiment to be a way that it is. One example of doing that is journey mapping. So for example, if you're a large organization, you could take a period, like a segment of the customer experience with with your brand, whether it be, perhaps an implementation or perhaps, the prospecting stage before a contract signed. And you map that out. What is every point during that journey with the customer that they're interacting with your brand that they might develop an opinion of your brand. And the customer, perhaps prospect, depending on what you're journey mapping, will have several interactions with your brand, either directly or indirectly within that journey. And it's so revealing to see what comes through when you're doing those exercises, because you should be doing them with any individual or business unit within the company that's involved in that segment. And again, many of those individuals don't necessarily come into direct contact with customers all the time. So it's really revealing in terms of what improvements can be made or what gaps are revealed in the customer experience when you do those. One example from an implementation standpoint is that you have InfoSec making sure that there are risk mitigated ways to take in customer data so that we can build an environment for them. And InfoSec is usually mostly concerned with risk mitigation, not necessarily the steps that a customer has to take with your brand to ensure that that risk is mitigated for them. Now they think, well, we're mitigating the risk, so that's that's a great thing that we're doing. We're doing our jobs. But if
Yeah.
a customer has to jump through 20 hoops and 10, authorizations and authentications and whatnot to get their data to you, particularly if they're not technical customers, and a persona identification is another element of journey mapping, but we could talk about that later. That's not a good experience to the customer. They might be quite
True.
frustrated, actually. So that's one example where a customer experience professional or executive can come in and show, for example, info security organization in a business, like what true customer first thinking is. You can still mitigate the risk, but perhaps also take into account what the experience looks like for the customer when they're going through those steps to ensure that they're de-risked.
That you're looking at that as a two-pronged approach, because as an end user, and I'm sure you experience this too, there are certain processes that I go through that I think, man, that was easy. They took a lot of the behind the scenes things and made them streamlined so that I don't have to mess with it. And then there are others that I go into and I am having to jump through all those hoops, like you said, and I'm doing it maybe weekly or just however often I have to get into the system. And it is, I mean, frustrating at a minimum, right? So
Yeah.
I like that you're looking at all of that.
Yeah.
So you mentioned risk. Let's talk about that a little bit because it is something that in fintech, it is constantly evolving. It has to be just due to the nature of risk and the way that people are always trying to just expose or hack or whatever they want to do to get access to personal information. And so how do you stay ahead of these changes while still delivering a seamless customer experience?
This is beside my core responsibility, but
Okay.
I've always worked alongside, for example, payments at FreshBooks. We manage payments, and I would just say that, keeping in touch with the latest out there with trusted publications and whatnot around what the trends are is very important. And also, if you're using AI, make sure that it's being continually trained to understand what the different ways in which scammers, so to speak, are trying to take advantage. I just think it's really important to be in front of that and not get complacent, because it's always something new. I mean, from email phishing and whatnot, it's always something new. But I will say that this isn't my core responsibility in
Right.
mitigation. So I would always be working alongside. My position would really be to report back to the folks working in fraud and risk on what we are detecting that doesn't seem right, so that they can use it to ensure that whatever they're feeding to the mechanisms that are trying to identify risk automatically are continuously updated. And
That's
then
such an important feedback loop. You're getting it straight from your customers' mouths and you're able to take quick action on that.
yeah, so we would have mechanisms implemented to try to identify fraud and risk. A lot of times it would be based on what the payment company that we were integrating with would offer. Um,
Okay.
some of it would be on our end as well, and it's interesting because we would have a lot of our customers being flagged for potential fraud and risk when they were actually running a legitimate business. And, it would be tough for them because at FreshBooks, we were serving small business owners where cash flow is very important. And oftentimes when you're flagged for risk, your payments are going to be stopped for a time until you have to submit all these documents and whatnot. And so
Mhm.
we were really passionate in trying to mitigate the amount of like legit, genuine customers that were getting flagged for risk while also upholding mechanisms that'll make sure that we're actually filtering out actual fraudsters. And so I know your question was about how have you stayed ahead of what the latest is in terms of inventive ways to scam people, so to speak.
Right,
I was
exactly.
always more like, how do we protect the customers that are not actually scamming from, risk detection systems that are set up? Because many customers that are doing legitimate business that are operating within the terms and conditions of the payment processor that they were utilizing were getting flagged for potential risk. And perhaps it was just that they didn't know exactly what documents to upload when they were first trying to, fill out KYC or other things like that. But also chargebacks are another issue that legitimate customers would get hit with oftentimes, and those are always very very difficult to deal with too because in trying to serve a customer, if they've had a chargeback and you're working for the service provider that's serving them, it's really the credit card company that has all of the control when a chargeback's filed. And so the most you can do is educate the customer, provide them resources to perhaps help mitigate how many chargebacks might be filed against them. But at the end of the day, if you're out there doing business and you're taking payments electronically, you're at risk for a chargeback. And
Yeah,
that
you
that was
absolutely
tough
are.
to deal with when we were supporting customers that were small business owners and we're promoting digital payments, and then they're getting chargebacks. And how do I manage this? I did provide the service. So those are always tough because the most you can do is provide resources to perhaps try to mitigate that in the future. But then they have to wait for the Visa or MasterCard or whatever it is to make a decision, essentially. And oftentimes the decision is made with preference to the chargeback filer because they're the customer of that credit card company.
Mhm. That's true. I, as a consumer, have had to use that from time to time, and they're usually pretty good to say, "Hey, have you at least tried to figure this out with the
Yeah.
merchant first?" You know?
Yeah.
But that someone could easily just lie and say they did try to work it out with a merchant, and then it does put the merchant in a difficult spot. What if it was a physical good that they shipped out and that person received and they have it and everything's working like it should,
Yeah.
but then it is the merchant that's on the hook? It can be a tough situation. I am excited to get into our next topic, which I know is something that is a passion of yours, or maybe even we'll say a platform of yours, and that is showing up as your own authentic self. So tell me a little bit about this, just to highlight an overview of your perspective on this, and then we'll get into some specific questions.
Well, I feel like my foray into the tech industry was I joined FreshBooks. That was a startup that didn't really have a lot of corporate rules or guidelines or a corporate vibe to it.
Yeah.
That was that was nice, and I still feel like people would join a company like that and think, well, I need to put on a kind of like corporate persona, particularly if I want to move up and do really well in this organization and get into leadership, because that's what's generally acceptable. And so I've always been into leadership, but I've also always very been unapologetically myself. And so, without any handbook of uniform guidelines to follow or whatever it may be at FreshBooks, I was just myself. And I joined that company when I was in my early-ish 20s, not a totally formed adult just yet. I think people are
Yeah.
kind of figuring themselves out in their 20s. And so as I was growing there, I didn't really feel any kind of like pressure to fit into any kind of mold, any corporate mold or, professional mold, whatever it may be. I'm always very respectful with, my colleagues. I always want everyone to have a good time while getting a lot of stuff done at work. And so the evolution of this was, my style kind of matured. It never got normal. It got perhaps more weird, so to speak, than it was when I joined FreshBooks. And they gave me a platform too to host a lot of events that we would have, whether it be something, business related, like an all hands, or something fun, like an offsite. So I would also get, because I've always kind of liked to be the center of attention, be on stage, public speak. I think that's very important for anyone to do, but it's not easy for everyone to do. So I got a lot of exposure and experience there, and always good reactions, good feedback. And I got promoted there as well. I was obviously delivering on, my core responsibilities in my role. Nothing else that I was doing in terms of, how I would dress to go to work, or, I would be behaving, which sense of humor, whatever it may be,
Yeah.
showing up like that to meetings. None of that got in the way. If anything, I'd argue that it perhaps helped because I stood out. As people move forward in their career, as they spend more years, developing themselves professionally, you start to feel more purposeful. What's my purpose? You know? And so I've developed this kind of purpose of encouraging or trying to influence others to show up as their true authentic selves at work. Through the years at FreshBooks, I saw several people really come out of their shells, folks that I would work with, folks that I managed, that I would encourage to, go and deliver a presentation and just be yourself, or wear that thing
Mhm.
to work, or, who really feel like you want to be, like, who are you truly, and just show up like that. And it was so nice to see folks seemingly really grow into their true selves there over the years. And so that's kind of what I try to encourage people to do, um, instead of feeling like they have to fit into into some kind of mold.
I appreciate you giving that background. And as you were speaking, I was wondering, how has that impacted those around you? Because there is this unwritten, or let's be honest, sometimes written rule that says you have to fit this certain mold in order to be professional, in order to be client facing, in order to be promoted, whatever it is. And so I love that people saw you just being bold and frankly being brave, because it does take that braveness to step out of what is expected and say, no, this is who I am. And I can still be respectful, professional, like all the things you mentioned before, that you're still doing those things, but you still get to be 100% yourself. And that other people came to the same conclusion and said, I'm going to dare to do this a little bit too. That just makes me happy. I love it. I bet it made you happy too.
Oh yeah. I think some secrets to this,
Mhm.
or not secrets, perhaps tips, is like, don't take yourself too seriously. I used to walk through the halls at the FreshBooks office and be compared to many an action movie character, or a character from a video game, or whatever. They're all nerds in tech, so they're always comparing you to some kind of, movie or something. And it was basically
Yeah.
what I was wearing. And I always really liked that. You never want to take yourself too seriously is thing one. Thing two, I think, having self-confidence, which not everybody has, but it is very important too. And I think that it's buildable if you are putting yourself out there professionally, in terms of taking opportunities to present something in front of a group. Many companies, for example, have lunch and learns that people can volunteer to go and present something that they know. And
Yeah.
that's a comfortable start before, maybe making a business presentation or something like that. Very nerve-wracking at first time, but it builds up your confidence to be able to get in front of a group of people, and speak to them and have their full attention. And so once you build that confidence, then you can kind of think about, okay, well, what do I really want to show up like at work? Like, if I had it my way, and, more people have it their way than they think, you can go and kind of, I don't want to say design, but just be who you are. And so I did see, like I said, I did see a lot of that come out from colleagues around me that perhaps I was trying to help influence. Yeah, and where I'm at now too, different company, and still very appreciated. It does bring attention. I do still like to hear the commentary about what I've worn to work on any given day. I do find it very funny, and I think that it would be very ignorant of me to think that nobody should be saying anything about it, because
True.
it's not,
And you don't want it to be, right? That's
yeah.
the whole point. And I like that you have that attitude where I am going to show up like this, and you can say whatever you want about it. Like it's both. You don't have to have everyone bite their tongue about what you're doing. I appreciate the comment too about you can build confidence bit by bit. I am naturally not a confident person. I'll just put that out there. And so things like I wanted to go out on my own without other people and be confident in that. Going out to eat, going to a movie, whatever it is. And so doing that, doing one small thing at a time helped me to have the courage to do it another time. And
Yeah,
so whether it's
and
your
I'm sure
clothing,
you
whether it's giving presentations, anything you can build.
and I'm sure you felt uncomfortable putting yourself out there little by little, and I've said this to so many people, so perhaps it's a motto of sorts, but, I feel like it's important to feel uncomfortable. You don't wanna be searching for creature comforts all the time. You wanna put yourself in a position where you're doing things that perhaps scare you a little bit. I mean, we've heard this a million times, and so but like you said, little by little, it doesn't have to be the biggest presentation opportunity that
Mhm.
you've ever had that you're suddenly, putting yourself out there to do. Start small, do something that makes you, a little bit nervous and uncomfortable. You'll have this rush of endorphins after it's done,
Sure.
and then, take it from there.
Yeah.
So yeah, like I have a quick funny story where I was hosting an annual general meeting
Hmm.
for a bunch of folks who are shareholders, and I wore these 6-inch platforms with a clear heel, these like very intense shoes to host the AGM. It was an in-person meeting.
Okay.
The compliments that those shoes got from the, cisgendered male CEOs in the room, it was very much like these folks wished that they could wear those shoes without perhaps causing like a gigantic stir or everyone looking at them and being like, "Are you okay?" And so I felt it felt very cool in that position amongst all of those individuals where there was this kind of like it was almost like, I wish I could do that, and this person's doing it, and it was widely accepted. I remember I was sitting in my seat after I was doing my hosting, because then they were doing the presentation part of it, and somebody had to leave early, and instead of just leaving the room, he kinda went across to whisper to me, "Love those shoes," before he left.
Awesome.
So I really appreciate stuff like that because it's kinda like, yes, this is appreciated and it's noticed, and I don't just wanna be noticed for myself. I want, again, to encourage others and influence others to be themselves.
And it impacts society as a whole. As I look back on my career, so I was reading your article, which we can link your article to this as
Sure.
well, because I think it'll be interesting for people to read. But as I was reading it, I was thinking, I have been in the industry and in business in general and technology specifically for a long time, like back to the 90s. And so I was thinking back to a job that I had where I was wearing just what I wanted to wear, and I didn't really think much of it because I was pretty young and I hadn't had the experiences yet that tell you, hey, you need to conform. But someone at work was being pretty passive aggressive. It was my boss. He just said, hey, you know what? You would look really good in a blazer. You should wear blazers to work. And so it just kind of is this message back then that what you're doing is not acceptable. And I think that that was in play for such a long time, and you look at the past 10, 15, even maybe more years, that those things have changed and people are able to say, no, I'm not going to live by your standard anymore. As long as I'm doing what I'm being asked of at work and I am being professional, I should be able to show up as I am. And then you made a comment in your article too about the guys who wear their flashy socks and you just see the little bit of it between their shoe and the cuff of their pant. I'm like, yes, I see that all the time, whether that is at work or even at church. And these people are often saying, yes, I want to express myself in
Working
whatever way
within
I
the
can.
constraint they're working within the constraints, perhaps
Yes.
self-imposed, but they're working within constraints. And I think that a lot of companies still have uniform guidelines or rules or whatever it may be. And I think a lot of that is truly around ensuring that people look professional at work. In other words, perhaps not like a slob.
Sure. Yeah.
That's understandable, 100%. What I would say is that even if your company has uniform guidelines and you're breaking them, but you're doing it in style and in your style, nobody's gonna ask you to, stop doing that.
Mhm. Mhm. And it takes that little bit of courage to just, again, take those steps, influence things, make
Yeah.
those small changes.
Yeah. So
So we mentioned also when you and I were talking before a little bit about psychological safety. And so I do want to touch on this for sure. And I would like to know from your perspective what role that plays in fostering authenticity at work and how leaders specifically can help create that safety for their teams.
Well, I think psychological safety is actually important not only for fostering authenticity, but also for fostering a productive and evolutionary work environment. Because if an individual has psychological safety, they're not afraid to call out something that maybe doesn't make sense. And if we go back to talking, we talked a little bit about developing a process and people follow processes. And when companies reach a certain size, there is this kind of need to develop and set a process that individuals within the company are to follow. With psychological safety, somebody might be following a process, but under a certain circumstance or with a certain scenario, they'll say, perhaps this doesn't make sense to follow the process for this one because of these things. And, oftentimes without psychological safety at work, and I mean, perhaps they might just not care, but that's a whole other story. They're not gonna call something out necessarily. They don't necessarily feel safe to do that. Perhaps there's some toxicity in terms of leadership where, they just wanna run things through process and not make much noise and move on. So I think that as a leader, it's very important to ensure that your team has psychological safety to call things out. And it then lends itself to being authentic at work too, because they feel safe. So not only do they feel safe to say, hey, we usually do this kind of thing under these circumstances, but it doesn't seem to make sense for this customer because of XYZ. Can we talk about this or can I do something different? That's like obviously very important, but also too, just feeling safe to be yourself at work. Psychological safety fosters that aspect too. So then you have this like well-rounded, I suppose, like employee engagement, happiness at work when, they're both thinking about calling things out that might not make sense process-wise, professionally, but then also showing up authentically as themselves at work, which, adds that kind of like spice of varieties to everyone that you're working with because everyone will have their own personality. They'll be showing their personality.
Yes, yes, exactly. Rather than maybe just those few people that they get to know well at work who get to see that. It's
Yeah,
just who you
exactly.
are. Yeah.
But I found, like, from a productivity and evolving the business perspective, the biggest benefit to psychological safety at work is facilitates that because you'll have folks in individual contributor roles or on front line that are feeling safe to call something out, and there's nothing better than that.
And that is something that takes a lot of courage to do, no matter what the circumstances. It can be hard to say, hey, this is happening, or I feel like we should be addressing this a different way, or I have an
Yeah.
idea to improve something.
I think it takes a lot of courage, but if you have a high level of psychological safety at work, I believe it can come second nature to a lot of these though.
Agreed. It can become a strength of yours, right? Once you know that it's accepted, it's heard, it is considered, right? Then it makes it again not so scary to do it the next time and to build upon it.
And I think it goes back to that people first leadership I was talking about earlier. I mean, if you're truly a people first leader, then you're considerate of how your people are feeling and you're considerate of the autonomy that they have within their role. And if you are a big enough company to have processes set forth, what I usually say is that they're not rules, they're guidelines because rules are meant to be followed, so to speak.
Hmm.
Guidelines are more a path that you should follow for the most part, but consider the circumstances, consider your autonomy. If something doesn't make sense to follow those guidelines for, that's where you might want to talk about it to your leader, depending on how much autonomy you have, or you can just make a decision yourself.
And guidelines, in my perspective, they help you make good decisions. You've got
Yes.
a collective of guidelines, take them all into consideration, and what's the best outcome? What's the
Yeah.
best path forward?
And
Yeah,
then to grow your decision-making muscle for folks on your team, you can discuss like, okay, what kind of decisions did you make this week based on certain circumstances following the guidelines that are set forth? You're still managing your team and you're still trying to help them grow, but you're not making them follow a set of rules and do the same thing every time. And I think that suppresses that kind of psychological safety too.
makes sense.
Yeah.
So, Colin, I have one more question for you
Sure.
before we end. You have learned a lot in the time that you have spent in your career, and I'm sure you have some great advice to share. So, what would be your biggest piece of advice for those who are either in or are looking to enter the customer experience space?
My biggest piece of advice for folks in or entering customer experience, it's probably don't be afraid to be really annoying. And what I mean by that is that, speaking directly to whomever this individual is, you will be perhaps surprised at how many folks that you work with might not be truly customer first, thinking customer first. And you might find that you have to repeat yourself a lot or to reiterate how to operate in that way. But at the end of the day, that's what the role is all about. So just don't be afraid to feel like you're being repetitive and annoying to try to champion the best possible customer experience for the customers at whatever company you're working for, or if it's your own.
Yeah, that's true. It can go both ways. That's perfect. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today and sharing your insights and your experiences. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you having me.
Thanks for watching our podcast today. I'm Kristen Nielsen. I'm the owner of Copper Canvas Ads Agency, and we partner with FinTechs to help them scale their business within a 12-month period. I've been in the industry for over 20 years, and I've seen how saturated the market can be, and therefore how difficult it can be to make your business stand out in a sea of other FinTechs that may look similar or maybe even slightly different. But how do you make yours stand out? How do you get your message to the right people and those with high buying intent? That's what Copper Canvas Ads Agency is here to do. We are a growth partner, and we take a deep dive into your business to really understand what your strong points are, where there may be areas of weakness, and how we can fill those areas of weakness and create a plan to move forward in a strong way and really scale. So if you are interested, simply go to our website, coppercanvasadsagency.com, and schedule a time. There are buttons right there on the front page for you to book a time, and then we'll love to talk to you and see what we're able to do together.